Dazed and uncertain, Brad turned away from the door and walked slowly back out to the front desk. Brad couldn't look the young clerk in the eyes when he picked up the envelope with the keys in it. He stood for a moment, not really understanding, when the clerk offered the services of a bellhop to carry the luggage up. Brad finally nodded and watched the uniformed man load his and Ashley's bags on a fancy cart. Brad carried his wife's purse, though the bellhop courteously offered to take it with the suitcases. They walked to the elevators and went up to the 6th floor. From the open door of the elevator, there were only a mercifully few steps to the room. Brad thanked the bellhop in a distracted way, tipped him too much so he'd go away quicker, and closed the door behind the guy. He stumbled into the bathroom and bent over to lean his head on crossed forearms on the vanity between the two sinks. Without warning, he was sick and vomited a thin stream of disgusting fluid into the right-hand sink. A second surge surprised him worse than the initial one. He almost let it dribble down his best dress shirt and pants. He couldn't allow that. He desperately fought for control. When he was sure the attack was over, he washed the mess down the drain. There was soon no sign of his weakness. He was glad of that. There was no evidence here of this disgrace anyway. No one would know except him. He looked around the room and sat on the edge of the big king-sized bed. Right now, Ashley should be over by the dresser, unpacking the luggage they'd bought for this trip. Instead, she was having a party down in that room. Probably with that ugly old couple, but he knew there would be men in there too. Lots of them probably. Brad stood up, staring wildly around the room. He would not stay here, waiting for his wife to come home. He would not. He made sure his wife's keys were in her purse. He saw her cell phone there too. He couldn't even call the woman he'd married just 1 year ago. Well, so be it. Heck, he'd had his doubts this marriage was going to last anyway. Some things weren't meant to be. Before he left the room, he tossed both entry cards onto the table beside her purse. Brad stepped back into the lobby and hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to do next. He'd left the room upstairs intending to get into the car and drive home. He didn't want to. He hated himself for doing it, but he glanced down the hallway to make sure Ashley wasn't hurrying toward him. He gave up and surrendered his last remnant of self-respect to walk down the side corridor and try that damned door once more. It was still locked and he was still the man left out. Disgraced and shamed a second time, he stalked quickly back down the hall and through the main lobby. Before he went through the big outside doors, a movement off to his left caught his attention. Customers were going and coming from several small shops down a wide hallway. The rental car agency was the third office down on the right. Brad stared at a moment before allowing his shoulders to slump even more than they were. As much as Ashley had humiliated him, he couldn't strand her here, several hundred miles away from her babies. He shook his head and walked down to the office to rent a compact car for the drive back to San Antonio. He kept his head down, hoping others wouldn't see the humiliation in his eyes. The interstate was busy and the drivers inclined more to anarchy than anything else. Brad didn't care. Being cut off by an aggressive driver was nothing to what his wife had done to him this morning. He almost welcomed the hectic feel to the traffic. At least he could disappear here. No one would remember his passing. He was secure in his anonymity. The sunny day had turned dark and windy. It got worse the further south he drove. A Pacific hurricane had come ashore in the Baja, and though only classified a tropical storm, now it was tracking right across central Texas. The radio said violent thunderstorms and heavy rains were popping up all over. The cheerful radio personality told his unseen audience it was a good day to stay in and not venture out. Brad laughed hysterically. If he'd only known all this was going to happen to him, he'd never have left the house. Just north of Waco, his cell phone buzzed. Dazed and bemused by shame and humiliation, Brad laughed when he saw who was calling. It was Ashley, the woman he'd been married to for a while. Well, she'd at least found where her room was. She was calling from her cell phone. He checked his watch. It was getting late and he was a long way from home. "Hey, Ash," he said when he punched the button to accept the call. "How's the party going?" he asked cheerfully. He wouldn't let the concept of her being at a party alone bother him anymore. After this morning, nothing would ever touch him again. "Brad," Ashley shot back. He couldn't figure out whether her voice was trembling because she was pissed off or what. He decided she probably was mad. So what else was new? "What, hun?" he answered casually. He wasn't going to let this get to him. Brad, where are you, baby? Ashley asked, apparently trying to control her voice. Brad didn't answer for a moment. There was a sign coming up on the side of the road. "Oh, 5 miles north of Waco," he said brightly. "Waco," Ashley said. "Waco? Bradley. What are you doing in Waco? Honey, I don't understand. How did you get to Waco? What's going on, baby?" "Oh, I dunno. Gimme a minute," Brad replied distractedly. His wife had asked so he would try to find out what was happening. He peered through the side window at the heavy clouds. When had the pavement gotten so wet? Bam! The flash of lightning and the slamming concussion came with no pause between them. More than one driver flinched at the close strike, and Brad had to pay close attention to his driving in order to find a way through suddenly slowing or stopping vehicles. When he put the cell phone to his ear again, Ashley was no longer there. Brad shrugged and tossed the phone to the passenger seat. 15 minutes later, give or take, Brad's cell phone started sounding off again and he picked it up. "Brad, honey, are you all right? What was that noise? What happened?" Ashley's voice sounded anxious and concerned. Hell of an actress, Brad told himself. Damn, she could almost fool him if he didn't know some things about her. Had learned some things about her, he corrected himself. He had to ponder her questions for a moment. He felt like he'd had at least a six-pack. Kind of like he was on a fluffy cloud and watching life go by. "Okay. Hey. Quit it," he said finally. When he hadn't answered immediately, Ashley had started screaming in his ear. "Yeah, that was just some lightning. It was real close," Bradley explained in a jovial tone. "It's raining real hard down here, Ash. Has any rain hit up there yet?" "No, there's no." "Brad, honey, where are you? Please come and see me, baby. I need you." Brad laughed at that. Yes-siree, she'd showed him exactly how much she needed him just a couple hours ago. "I told you where I was," he said a little testily. "I was north of Waco. But now I'm south of Waco. Did I tell you it's raining really hard down here? It's really coming down. I'm here to tell you it is something else. Hey," he added, remembering a question of his own, "you didn't say. How's that party with your buddies going, huh? Boy, the way you and ol' Ma and Pa Kettle were going at it, I guess you folks are having fun, huh? Ha ha. Made a funny there, didn't I? Everyone up there, huh? Ha ha. Damn. You know what, Ashley? I didn't know you went for that much older a man and woman. Live and learn, I guess, huh? Phew." Ashley was quiet for a time and Brad almost put the phone down. Women, they sure didn't know how to hold a phone conversation. When someone said something and asked a question, it only stood to reason the other person would answer. Or say something anyway. "Brad, honey," Ashley said at last. Her voice was strained but carefully controlled. "I'm so sorry Floyd and Ann and I got separated from you, but it was just an accident. We looked and looked for you but we couldn't find you, sugar. We didn't know where you'd gone. Please come back to the hotel, baby. I need you." Abruptly, Brad's mind cleared. The traffic, the dangerous weather, and terrible road conditions were brought back into sharp focus. He took his foot off the accelerator and slowed drastically. Briefly, he wondered how he'd been keeping the car on the road going that fast. "No way. Baby," he retorted coldly. "I saw them with their hands all over you and you letting them. And letting them tongue kiss you right in front of me. Huh, Ashley, dear. You do not need me and you showed it real clear. Don't lie to me, sugar. I saw exactly how much your solemn promise means to you. I saw you go in that party with those old and you locked the goddamn door behind you." He stopped short to suck in a deep breath of air. "Nah. You don't need me, Ashley," he said calmly, almost formally. "I was under the impression you loved me but I see different now. Goodbye, Ashley." He thumbed the disconnect button without waiting for an answer, snapped the cell phone closed and dropped it on the seat beside him. A second later he retrieved it and turned it off. There was nothing more he wanted to say to the woman who'd been his wife so briefly. Hurting, angry, and ashamed by turns, he drove carefully the rest of the way home. As he pulled in the driveway, the girls, Ashley's daughters, crossed his mind. He shrugged. They were with Ashley's mother and she wouldn't be expecting him or Ashley to come for them until Sunday evening. There was nothing he had to do tonight for anyone. Inside the dark house, he drank a beer and stuffed down a sandwich, tasting neither. The TV he turned on couldn't hold his attention. An hour after he got home, He went to bed to take refuge in a deep, dreamless sleep. Brad spent Friday morning in the garage, finishing a big dollhouse he'd been working on for a month for the girls. It kept his mind busy so he didn't have to think. Outside, the storm continued to dump huge quantities of rain on a city already inundated with too much water. Every gully in the county was running full and the news was full of street and highway closings. There were about the usual number of high water rescues and foreseeable reports of accidents caused by too much speed on wet pavement. Starting just before noon, the rain began to let up and the skies began to clear from north to south. By mid-afternoon, the sun was shining and the steaming ground was drying. It was South Texas. If you didn't like the weather, you only had to wait a little while. Shortly after 3 p.m., he heard the car in the driveway and knew his wife was home. He considered staying in the garage, but he suppressed the urge. He was through avoiding confrontations. A sullen anger had built then dissipated over the course of the day. He felt drained and worn out. Ashley came in the front door slowly. She was apprehensive and wondered what was in store. She hadn't gone by her mother's. If Brad had already been there to pick up the girls, her mother would want to know why Ashley didn't already know about it. That was a conversation Ashley dreaded only slightly less than the discussion she expected to have with her husband. She was both relieved and sorry her daughters weren't here to greet her. She sighed. Brad was waiting for her in the kitchen, having just come in from the garage. He was wiping his hands on a shop towel, so she knew he'd been working on something out there. She guessed it was the dollhouse. "Hello," she said to her husband, not sure she'd get a reply. He nodded tersely. "Hi," he said after a distinct pause. "How are ya?" Ashley winced. For a couple who'd been in the habit of kissing each other goodbye and again when they saw each other, it was a cold greeting. "I'm okay," she said tiredly. "It was a long drive," she offered. "I hear that," Brad replied without interest. "You should try it with a hurricane blowing and tornadoes twisting all around." He might have been talking to a stranger he met standing in line at the supermarket. She knew her husband had a side he never showed her or the girls. He was an aggressively confident and successful sales manager for a rapid expanding local firm. At home, Brad was loving and kind. The kids adored him. She did too, but she'd let things get away from her lately. She hadn't told him how much she loved him, not really in far too long. Brad honey," she began. Her eyes fastened on the percolator on the countertop. Can I have a cup?" she asked, not sure if Brad would allow it or not. "Oh, sure," he said quickly. "Sorry," he said contritely. "I should have asked you if you wanted one." He hurried to take her usual mug from the cupboard and poured it 3/4 full. Brad took his coffee hot and black, but Ashley needed the strong brew dilated a bit. She took a small carton of cream from the refrigerator and mixed in enough to fill the mug to the brim. She tasted it cautiously. It was just cool enough to drink. Ashley took a seat at the kitchen table, hoping Brad would sit across from her as he usually did, but he would not. Brad stood by the sink and drank from his own mug. He wasn't ignoring her, he just had nothing to say. Ashley sighed to herself and drew in a deep breath. "Brad, I am truly sorry, baby," she told him, hoping he would hear the remorse in her voice. "I don't know how to tell you how bad I feel about all this," she added. "I can't understand how it all happened, and I just hurt so bad because of everything." Brad took a sip of his coffee. "Just what did happen, Ash?" he asked quietly. He took another quick swallow. "Please tell me how you walked right away from me and left me standing like a fool at the hotel desk. I've been wondering how a woman can do that to her husband." Ashley winced. "Honey, I thought you were right behind me. I thought we were going to sit and visit, just talk with Floyd and Ann for a while." "No, you didn't," Brad replied quickly but without rancor. He blew on his coffee to cool it a little before his next drink. "There was no we in any damn thing you did yesterday. Actually, this is what happened. You took off in a fast walk without saying one damn word to me and left me holding your damned purse too." He sipped at the coffee while studying the liquid in his mug. He couldn't look at his wife because she'd see the rising anger in his eyes. "Never saw you do that before," he muttered. "You always keep that purse right by your side." "I know," Ashley said quietly. She raised her hands, only to drop them helplessly in her lap. "I don't know what I was thinking. I don't remember thinking at all, Brad. It's like I was in a daze or something." She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. "I was so shocked when Ann and Floyd were there," she explained. "It never occurred to me I'd see anyone up there I knew. Ann and Floyd don't even live in Texas anymore." They moved to Alabama 2 years ago. They said they came back to visit their daughter. Interesting, Brad commented. He kept his voice calm. Ashley waited for him to say something else, but he motioned with his cup for her to continue. Yeah. Well, I don't know what happened, but all of a sudden we were walking and talking and I didn't know you weren't right behind me, Brad. I swear I didn't, honey. How could I have been right behind you, Ashley? Brad asked. He sounded curious. What? Ashley replied. Well, I just thought you were. Did you? Oh, I don't know. Did you reach out to take my hand and pull me close so I'd be right there? Brad asked, blowing gently on his coffee. Ashley shook her head miserably. Strange, Brad commented quietly. Well, heck, did you figure out I wasn't beside you, and let's see, did you stop and yell back at me maybe? Ashley fastened her eyes on the tabletop. No, you didn't do that either, did you? Brad said. Oh, by the way, just for my information, Brad remarked, would you tell me why my bride of 12 months couldn't be bothered to even introduce me to her old buddies? Brad rasped. The anger was slowly coming to the front. He carefully throttled it back. Ashley's fingers twined about themselves in her lap. Baby, I'm so sorry, Ashley sighed. That was so wrong. I know it was, I just wasn't thinking. It was like I was in a trance and I couldn't feel anything, you know? The silence built for a moment. Both swigged their coffee and stared at their hands. They weren't what you said, Ashley said eventually. Brad cocked his head to one side quizzically. Ashley thought he knew exactly what she was referring to, but she wasn't going to get any help today. She sighed to herself. I've never been with Floyd and Ann, she said in a low voice. Really? Brad asked interestedly. Damn, you could have fooled me. Looked like you three were awfully close pals, you know? Hell, they made you forget about your husband. They made you forget about common ordinary courtesy. You wouldn't have treated the bellhop as badly as you did me. Brad made himself stop. He took 2 quick swallows of coffee and freshened his cup with more directly from the percolator. When he turned back to his wife, he'd wiped all the emotion from his face. Hey, I interrupted, he said by way of an apology he didn't really feel. He motioned to her. Go ahead. You were walking away from your husband without saying a word to him, without trying to get his attention or grab his hand or anything, with 2 old geezers who you knew when you were a hot little piece of in the clubs, but they never had this with you. Is that where we were? He asked. Sarcasm was beginning to edge into his tone. Ashley winced. We walked. I remember walking down a big hallway, she said at last, and then we turned. A frown of confusion came over her features. We turned down another hall and then we went into one of the hotel conference rooms, honey. She waited for Brad to make a comment, but he refused to say anything. He concentrated on the mug of coffee as if it were the most important coffee in the world. Anyway, there was a band getting ready for a party later in the evening. We could barely hear and had to practically yell at each other, she said. Then oh, God, then it hit me that you weren't there. Floyd said maybe you went up to the bar at the other end of the room or something, and we looked, but the bar wasn't even open yet. Ashley's voice broke as she related what she remembered happening. Honey, I'm just so sorry. I don't know what happened to me. I don't. Her husband watched her waiting until she regained control of herself. That all? He asked. Ashley nodded. Brad snorted derisively. Lie, he said emphatically. You left out a few little things, sugar. Like, you were walking away with 2 old people I didn't know and wasn't good enough to be introduced to. They were too old. You say you never did at one of your clubs, but heck, you're gonna love this. Those 2 miserable pieces felt right at home playing with you while y'all walked down the hall. Did you forget all about that, Ashley? Actually, I think that damned old woman grabbed you when y'all stopped to open that big door down that second hallway. What about that? He looked at Ashley contemptuously. Any more things you leave out? He asked. She couldn't respond. She could only hang her head. I didn't realize what was happening while we were walking, she said after a long while. Her voice was husky. I mean, I did, but it wasn't real somehow. I keep telling you I was so shocked by seeing them, by seeing anyone I knew from back then, that I was on automatic pilot or something. I made them stop, she offered. Right inside that door you talked about, I made them quit touching me. I knew you wouldn't like it, she added. Yeah, right, Brad replied. You're on autopilot, got it. He made an angry gesture and turned to stare out the kitchen window. He didn't like looking at his wife anymore. You know something that really pisses me off? Brad asked. He didn't wait for a reply. Damn you. You don't even let me hug you in public, much less play with you. But you let them stick their goddamn tongues and you walk through a big lobby with everyone there. He whirled around for a moment to regain control. But what the hell, huh? I'm just your husband, right? His voice was bitter. He watched nothing at all in the backyard while he sipped coffee. So, go on, he urged her. Hell, don't stop now. We're learning so much about each other this weekend. What happened next? Tell me about that fat woman who took her top off at the door right when you were going in. You can tell me, he asked facetiously. Ashley jerked her head up. No, she said forcefully. She wanted Floyd to play with them, not me, and she didn't take off her top, she just opened it up. Some guy with the convention came over and made her do it back up. She went away and we never saw her again, okay? That's all that was. Okay. Old Floyd was too busy with you to help her out, I guess, huh? Maybe she should have Frenched you like Anne did. Maybe she would have gotten a little more from you, huh? Ashley shook her head violently. She was beginning to get mad. Brad noticed and was glad. If she got angry enough, she might leave him and this whole marriage thing could be laid to rest. Where he'd been afraid she'd leave him because of earlier arguments this afternoon, he hoped she would. I told you, Ashley said determinedly. I made them both stop with the touching right there inside, and they did. I think them kissing on me was one of the things that made me feel so weird and out of control, honey. I didn't expect to be attacked like that, you know? Darn too bad I wasn't there to see you make them stop touching you, Brad said stoically. It doesn't explain why the hell you let them do it as long as they did, but what the F, huh? You were on autopilot and didn't notice, is that about right? Ashley moaned. She didn't have an answer. So anyway, Brad said quickly. What next? Y'all were sitting in there yelling at each other and you were having a fine little visit with your old buddies in the conference room where they were setting up a bar and a band was tuning up, right? I think that's where you left off. So then what happened? Ashley was hurting. Yeah, she'd been wrong to let herself be so distracted she lost control, but she was doing her best to show her husband she was sorry. She began to resent the way he was grilling her. You just have to know every little detail, don't you, Bradley? You really need to treat me this way and make me tell you over and over how sorry I am about everything. Ashley asked curtly. Her Irish temper was beginning to peek through her regret at how yesterday had gone. Well, I think I have a right to know, Ash, don't you? Brad said in a tone Ashley couldn't decide was actually conciliatory or not. She stared at the man she'd married a year ago. Okay, I'll tell you every little detail just like you want, she said spitefully. What do you want to know? Oh, I was just waiting for you to go on, Brad said mildly. He looked at her over the brim of his mug. He waited. All right, Ashley said more calmly. We sat and talked, yelled at each other, as you so kindly pointed out. Was what you said, not me, Bradley murmured. Why? Yes, thank you so much for reminding me. We were there yelling at each other and then, Ashley's eyes lost their focus for a moment and the stiffness left her face. I don't know how to explain it, but all of a sudden I could think again. It was like someone threw a bucket of ice water in my face or something. Suddenly, I could feel that cheap damn folding chair I was sitting on was missing one of the rubber things on the end of the leg, and it was uncomfortable to sit on the seat and the noise was blaring in my ears, and I don't know. I just kind of woke up and you weren't there and I didn't know what to do. Could we back up for just a sec, hun? Brad asked considerately, cutting into Ashley's recitation. She nodded. Something I don't understand is why you locked that big door behind you. Ashley frowned, apparently not quite understanding. You keep saying that, but I don't know what you're talking about, Brad. We didn't lock anything, she said without conviction. Well, the damned thing was sure as hell locked when I got there, baby, Brad announced. I guess you never knew. You see, I ran after you trying to catch you or I wouldn't have seen all this. When I got to that door, I pounded on it so hard people thought I was crazy or something. Brad put his coffee down and held up his fists so his wife could see. The flesh on the underside of his hands where he'd slammed them against the heavy door was puffy and already beginning to turn black and blue. The bruises would be with him for a long time. Ashley hung her head and her shoulders jerked with the force of her crying. She began. Sorry. Yeah, I know, Brad finished for her. Still, it happened and my hands hurt, and all the sorries in the world won't make them one damn bit better, will they? God, Bradley, I can't explain it, Ashley sobbed. I wasn't really functioning then. I was awake like someone threw a switch. She wasn't able to talk for a few minutes. It was horrible, she continued when she could. We went to look for you but we couldn't find you anywhere. I didn't have my cell phone. Her voice broke, remembering she hadn't had the phone because she'd walked off and left her purse on the hotel's front desk. I finally remembered. I figured out I should go up to our room, but then I didn't have a key. I had to talk the desk clerk into giving me another card, but you weren't there and I didn't know where you were." She stopped for a space. Just looking at her husband was so hard now. Without her anger to support her, she was reduced again to a miserable shame at what had happened. "When I called you, you sounded so strange," Ashley continued. "It was like you were someone else and I didn't know you. Then there was that awful explosion and you weren't there anymore. I couldn't get through to you for a long time and then you wouldn't come back. You didn't even want to talk to me," she said. Her voice failed her at the last. She could only whisper, "Is that all, Ash?" Brad asked in a more gentle tone than she expected. She nodded, not trusting herself enough to speak. Brad looked at her, brooding over what she had said and what she hadn't said. He saw she was distraught and worried. He didn't think she could fake the concern and shame she showed, but he hadn't thought she could do such humiliating things to him either. He refilled his mug to delay a few seconds longer and then sat at the table across from Ashley. "There are a couple of things that aren't right about this, Ash," he said. "I still don't have a good handle on why a woman who married me said she loved me and promised she would have nothing to do ever again with this. I don't understand how she can throw all those promises away in the blink of an eye and waltz off with strangers. No, don't even try, Ash, you already did it. I just can't get my mind around the whole concept of how someone who loves me can dump me so damn fast she runs off and forgets her purse. Do you have any idea how low that makes me feel? Do you have any notion how humiliating it was for me to run after you like a puppy following his master down the hall?" Ashley stared at him. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. "Ashley," Brad said earnestly, "do you have any clue what it's like to call out to the one you love and who should love you and she doesn't hear? She just keeps on walking? Do you?" Ashley couldn't see his hands. It was taking all of his willpower to keep them in his lap to avoid balling up his fist and shaking it in her face. "I think you know how much it hurt for me to watch them with their hands all over you," Brad continued after a moment. "You told me what you were feeling or not feeling or something like that. I don't understand it. You see, I can't imagine how you could not be in control of yourself, but there it is. I'm not sure I'll ever feel any better about that, but who knows?" He watched his wife cry for a long moment. There was a lump in his throat that wouldn't go away no matter how hard he swallowed. "The thing that is really killing me," he said when he had control again, "is I don't know how to say it. It's like you deserted me at the snap of a finger. You said you didn't even think about what you were doing. I thought we had a, what do you want to call it, a deep commitment to each other. But you left it behind and walked away without any consideration for me at all. That hurts, Ashley. Right now, I've got a big ache right in the pit of my stomach and an empty place in me where I used to have all this trust in you. You killed that and I don't know if I'll ever get it back." Ashley continued to cry. She wished she could curl up somewhere and die. "I'm so sorry, honey," Ashley finally choked out. "All I wanted was a weekend alone with you where we didn't have to worry about the kids and everything. I thought it would be so romantic and I could just love you the whole time, and it blew up right in my face. Darling, it just blew up." After a moment's silence, Brad cleared his throat. "So I don't know, Ash," Brad said. "I don't know where we go to from here and I don't know how we get there." He let the words lay there for a time. "But I do know we can't do anything if you're going to keep on lying to me," he said harshly. Don't do it. You are still lying," he said quickly when she would have protested. "Oh, I don't know if you're telling me the truth about what was going on in your head or whether anything was going on like you told me. I don't know if I can trust you after you cut the ground out from under my feet like that, but I can't prove anything I didn't see. But I can see this. I know 3 lies you've told me. 1 on the drive up to Dallas and 2 more outright lies sitting right here in our kitchen. First," he said, plowing on. He held up the forefinger on his right hand to keep count. "First, you said you hadn't had any time to tell me about the convention being held in that hotel, and that's a lie, isn't it, Ashley?" She bit her lip and nodded. "Well, I'm glad you can admit it," Brad remarked unsympathetically. "Maybe it's a good thing I don't know. I do know the hotel called you on Monday because I rewound the messages on the machine. It didn't happen just before we left like you led me to believe. If you'd intended to tell me, you had plenty of time over those 3 days, Ashley." "Damn it, don't you think I should be entitled to a vote in something like that?" he asked. His finger trembled in the air from his anger. "You need to know this," he said when his pulse dropped a little. "I'm tired of being a second-class partner in this marriage. I'm tired of taking the short end of the stick all the time, and I'm not going to put up with it anymore." He took a deep breath. "Second, you told me you didn't have a clue there would be anyone up there you knew from your parties. And third, you told me you wanted to spend a romantic weekend with me. That's what we started talking about a couple months ago, Ashley, but you changed it. Don't say it. Ashley, don't say a word, he warned her. He was holding 3 fingers up in the air. Ash, he said, leaning over the table to emphasize his words, there isn't a damn thing romantic about this, and that's what those people were going to do what they are doing right this minute. You've been lying to me for 3 days about what you wanted out of this trip, and that hurts. And when you said you didn't think you'd run into anyone you knew, you lied again, Ash. You knew damned good and well when you heard about the convention it would. I'm sure it did draw a crowd from our own fair city. There were bound to be a lot of people from here up at that group, and you were looking for them. I watched you in the parking lot, Ash. You were practically standing on your tiptoes to look over all the cars and staring at people to find someone you knew. Someone who could take you out of your boring life with that fool of a husband you got married to, he said bitterly. You found what you were looking for, Ash. Now I'm pretty sure old Floyd and Anne weren't who you wanted to be there. You wanted to find someone else you knew, and you would have found more folks there if you'd stayed longer. You know, the only thing I only wonder about now is who it was you figured on being at that convention. What's his name, Ashley? Brad asked her, his voice low and angry. He watched her sob for a little while. She was shaking her head no, but he didn't believe her. He couldn't reach out to console her, though it hurt him to watch her cry so inconsolably. His own pain was still too fresh, too powerful. I'm going to go work on the girl's dollhouse, he said when he could stand it no more. He stood. He wanted, but couldn't reach down to touch her shoulder. Turning, he marched out the door and into the garage. Saturday was no better than Friday for the couple who'd been married only a year and a few days. They didn't try to avoid each other, but neither did they seek each other out. They spoke politely to each other, discussing inconsequential topics, but the passion between them was dead. Sunday flowed into Monday, and the weekly work schedule reasserted itself. Brad slept on the living room sofa more often than not. Ashley slept in a cold bed upstairs with the door closed so no one would hear her cry. Brad worked a lot of hours overtime, even when he could have chosen not to. He came home after the supper table had been cleared only to be with Kathy and Cindy for a while before they had to go to bed. He was not eating well and was losing weight, but he told himself this was a good thing. He got too little exercise and could stand to lose a couple of pounds. Ashley went to work, picked up her babies from the daycare, cooked dinners and cleaned house. Beyond that, she spent much time staring blankly into space. Playing old favorite CDs no longer consoled her, and no book she picked up held her interest. The first week passed, then a second and a third. The children were quieter and better behaved. They couldn't comprehend what exactly had happened to their world, but they could sense its impact. Brad and Ashley lavished affection and care on the 2 little girls, but shared none between themselves. Kathy and Cindy were watching the latest cartoon adventure out on DVD. They and their new daddy had picked it up just today, and they paid the TV screen their whole attention as they watched the images dance and cavort on the screen. Brad was less interested in watching the cartoon than he was in watching the 2 happy children. 3-year-old Cindy could barely follow what was going on, but she loved the color and the action. Her sister Kathy was all of 4 years old and Cindy's idol. Kathy understood more of the storyline, but not that much more. Still, she pointed out many things to her younger sister she thought were important or interesting. The half-sisters were close. They held hands more often than not. They were tonight. Their stepfather loved them. He couldn't imagine any father loving his children more. In the 2 years he'd known them, they'd slipped inside his guard and claimed his heart. He couldn't imagine living without them, but he was afraid there wouldn't be very many more evenings like this. The hurt wasn't going away. It wasn't even fading, as most things did with a little time. When Ashley came into the room and sat beside him, Brad looked up at her and nodded civilly. He didn't smile, and he didn't reach out for her as he would have a month ago. Ashley sat a few inches from him, careful not to touch him lest he move further away from her. It had happened more than once over the past few weeks. I have to tell you some things, Ashley said after a while. She didn't look at her husband, but she could sense a sudden tension in him. He didn't reply, but he inclined his head to listen. I called Anne and Floyd today, she said quietly. Brad said nothing, but the foot he'd propped up on the ottoman slipped to the floor. He leaned forward, hardly more than a tiny shift of his weight, but he was ready to stand. I told them I never wanted to see or hear from them ever again, Ashley said. She left the simple statement hang in the air for a moment. Brad's body relaxed slightly and he settled back into the overstuffed cushions. They apologized for what they did, she continued. They said they stepped over the line and hated what they'd done. Floyd said they hated what their irresponsibility had done to us. He said it was unforgivable and he understood why I wouldn't ever talk to them again. He's right, Brad whispered, not wanting to disturb the two young girls enjoying the cartoon. It is unforgivable, he apologized, Brad, Ashley murmured. They're about as miserable as we are. Good, Brad said a little louder than he intended. The girls turned to see what was going on, but Brad only gestured at the TV and smiled. Cindy and Kathy smiled back. Children don't expect to comprehend everything their parents say or do. His remark disappeared into the bottomless pit of such incidents they couldn't understand. In scant seconds, the DVD was again their sole focus. They're responsible partly for what went on that day, Brad said at a more moderate volume. Ashley winced. She knew who her husband held responsible for the rest of what had happened at the hotel. I know, Ashley said softly. She took a deep breath. I've done a lot of thinking, she began slowly. I thought about what you said about lying to you. I talked to Mom too. Okay, Brad said noncommittally. I told Mom a little about what had happened, Ashley said with a sigh. Not the that stuff, but about walking off with two friends and stuff. She took a deep breath. Mom wanted to take a baseball bat to me, Ashley said softly. She waited for her husband to say something. Ash, I don't know why you're telling me this, he said finally. If you think I need some kind of validation for the way I feel about what happened, I don't. No, Ashley said hastily. I was just saying she was one more person who wanted me to start thinking about what the heck I've been doing, okay? After a moment, Brad nodded. Okay, Brad repeated. His tone said he neither agreed nor disagreed. Anyway, I did lie to you about the reservation and stuff by not telling you when I found out, and I guess I lied about the reasons I still wanted to go up there too, Ashley said in a defeated voice. I knew I had to tell you about the convention, but I kept putting it off. I told myself there was plenty of time and I never once thought about why I was delaying. She sighed. I've spent a lot of time by myself lately, she said carefully, and that makes you look pretty close at yourself. You don't get to make excuses when it's just you talking inside your head, she added. Brad turned away from the children and the TV for the first time. Introspection. He stopped to clear his voice and start over. Taking a good look at yourself is a good thing to do sometimes, he said quietly. Anyway, what did you decide about the excuses you made to yourself? Ashley dropped her eyes to her hands clamped tightly together in her lap. I was putting off telling you because I was pretty sure you wouldn't want to go, that you'd want to get the hotel to move us to another place. And I was doing that because I really wanted to be there, where the excitement was happening and stuff Her voice dropped in pitch and volume as she spoke. I was lying to myself some too. I never let myself look at why I wasn't telling you, but that's no excuse. I'm a grown woman and I knew better. She looked away to hide the sudden sheen of tears in the corner of her eyes. She dabbed at the dampness with a tissue brought with her just for this possibility. I've tried and tried to figure out whether you were right about me wanting to find a specific someone there, but I can't, Brad, she said in a forceful whisper. There was no man, honey, I know you can't believe me right now, but there hasn't been a man in my thoughts except you from the day we met. She was quiet for a while. I think I was actually looking for someone though, she admitted finally, but I wasn't looking for anyone in particular. It was just a vague, hazy idea of maybe introducing you to someone nice, to show you that they weren't the ogres you think they are, she said, finishing with a rush. Her voice broke slightly. She was trying to be matter-of-fact about what she was saying, but it was too personal. The wetness in her eyes grew and overflowed. I swear to you, darling, Ashley said fervently. I'm sure that's what I was feeling. I never thought about the thing going on up there. It sounds dumb, but the fun was the least of it. I never said you were slimy or anything of the sort, Brad protested softly. Ash, he wet his lips. Look, I know in my head, I know, intellectually speaking, that people who go to places like that aren't evil monsters. You're one of those people. You used to go to those clubs and I love you more than life itself, so all of them can't be. He stopped. It was hard to speak around the lump in his throat. For the first time in a month, he admitted to himself how miserable he was these days. Ashley's heart had almost stopped when Brad said he loved her, not he had loved her, he said he did love her more than life itself. She began to hope just when she'd decided there was none. I still don't know why I did those things, Brad. I don't have an excuse, she said in a low voice. I'm so ashamed. Usually they don't do those things, she said softly. Everything in the lifestyle is about being discreet and being behind closed doors. When Floyd told me they went over the line, he was being nice to himself, she explained. I've tried to remember what I was thinking when I saw Anne and Floyd, but I can't, she said, almost moaning. I can see in my mind a split second of incredible surprise and a realization they were the last people in the world I wanted to meet there, and then, I was just overwhelmed with everything, Brad. I don't know any other way to say it. She stared straight ahead, then shook her head in dismay. She sniffed and touched the damp tissue to her nose before swallowing hard. I hate myself for letting them kiss me like they did, honey. I knew it was terribly wrong and I couldn't stand knowing what you would think of me, and then everything, the lights, the crowd, everyone moving around like bumblebees, the excitement I was trying to push away. I felt a little faint. My heart was pounding and then I disconnected, she said. I swear to you, Brad, I don't remember how I got down that hall and into that room. All I have is a foggy memory here and there. She had to stop to breathe. I remember swatting Floyd's hands off me. I have a vague memory of being glad he'd only touched me through my clothes. That's not much, but I guess I have to take what I can get, she said slowly. I don't even remember Anne touching me at all, but I'm sure she didn't after that. I don't remember much about what we talked about, but what I do remember, it was just talk about friends and couples we used to know in the weather. We talked about that for a minute or two, I remember. Then, I was in a panic all of a sudden and I didn't know why, she said plaintively. I guess my brain suddenly realized what I'd done to you. For sure, I knew you weren't with me and everything came crashing down. I looked all around but I couldn't find you and I screamed at Floyd and Anne. I think Floyd said you must be at the bar and he went to look, but I yelled at him because he couldn't possibly know what you looked like and I had to go look myself. Then I went to all the hotel bars and the food places and bars in the city convention center next to the hotel. I couldn't get rid of Floyd and I finally hit him on the arm and made him go away. I'm sure everyone up there remembers the crazy lady who cried and screamed at while she ran from one bar to the next, she said quietly. One place said they were calling the cops and I ran away, she remarked with shame. Anyway, I looked all over before even thinking about my cell phone. I was so stupid, she said angrily. It took me forever to make them understand they had to give me another keycard, and Ashley stopped her narration abruptly. She'd told herself she was going to tell her husband what was in her heart without making excuses and without embellishment. She dabbed at fresh tears with the soaked tissue. Shifting his body around, Brad took a handkerchief from his back pocket and put it in her hand. She nodded gratefully. Well, anyway, she said at length, you know all the rest. They were quiet for a long while, each digesting what she'd said. The silence lengthened and deepened. Brad, Ashley whispered brokenly when she couldn't hold back any longer. Please don't leave me, baby, she begged. I need you so bad. I love you with all my heart and the girls love you more than they do their real dads. She cried silently for a moment. Brad said nothing. He'd thought she was the one about to leave the marriage, not him. He cleared his throat. Honey, Ashley said desperately. You said before we got married you thought sometimes we shouldn't get married because I knew all about being married and you didn't know anything, remember? You were so wrong, she said bitterly. I was married twice before we met and I screwed both of them up. I don't know one thing about how to make a marriage work, she admitted. I think you're my last chance, she whispered. If I can't make it with the most wonderful man I ever met, I can't make it with anyone. Please don't throw me out, Brad, darling, she begged. I can't change what I already did, but I know what I did wrong and I won't ever be like that again. Baby, please, we can make this work. My God, my girls love you so much, honey, please? There was a long silence. The two young girls laughed happily at something one of the cartoon figures said. Ashley's heart sank as she waited. She gave up. There was nothing more to be said. Wearily, she gathered herself to rise and go to somewhere else in the house. Brad took her hand in his. He didn't move otherwise. He had already turned back to the TV. Ashley hardly dared breathe. It had been so long since her husband had accepted any physical contact, much less reached out to touch her. Slowly she put her other hand on top of his. Lifting slowly she brought his hand to her lips and kissed his fingers softly before letting their coupled hands fall gently to her lap. Her eyes were brimming with new tears, but she refused to mop them away with the handkerchief. It was only when the final credits were showing on the screen that she released her tight grasp of Brad's hand and wiped her cheeks dry so the children would never know she'd been crying. Brad climbed the stairs that night to join his wife in their bedroom for the first time in a month. He didn't know whether he was right in doing it or not, but he loved the woman he'd married. If he wasn't going to leave and divorce her, he owed it to himself to let things begin to recover as much as they could. He didn't hold out much hope, but he wasn't going to work so hard at learning how to be single again. Another summer had come and almost gone in southern Texas. It was hot, but that was normal. Folks didn't bother remarking on it except to wonder facetiously what this thing, rain, was that they heard about on the Weather Channel. 5-year-old Kathy would be starting kindergarten in a few weeks, and 4-year-old Cindy was an enthusiastic force of nature doing her best to energize an entire pre-kindergarten class. They were growing taller now, developing their own personalities. Next week, the final hearing would be held in the Bexar County Courthouse and the adoption proceedings would be complete. New birth certificates would be issued naming Brad as their father and everything. When they started their classes, their last name would be the same for the first time in their lives. They loved their parents and were loved in return, and they knew it. The marriage between their mother and new father had survived, but it had been tough. There had been disagreements, a few arguments, and many late-night discussions, but their relationship was intact. Most people would say it had healed. Brad wasn't so sure. That his wife had disconnected, as she put it, under the stress of the bubbling excitement and all the activity at the hotel last year still depressed him at times. Even though she swore she would never again yield to a temptation to keep him in the dark about anything, Brad had doubts. Ashley seemed sincere though. He had no reason to doubt her, not really. He decided she probably meant what she said. It didn't cheer him much on those occasions when he let himself brood on the shame and humiliation she'd heaped on him that afternoon in Dallas. There were too many things left unexplained, things that had crushed him at the time, but things Ashley was more than happy to forget as fast as she could. She had shamed herself too and suffered herself. Hers was a self-imposed chastisement. Brad hadn't had a choice. Seemingly, Ashley didn't understand some things she'd said to Brad as they sat on the sofa watching the girls. For instance, she'd remarked a couple of times on the excitement she'd felt. She even blamed it for having been overwhelmed in the hotel lobby. It told him she craved excitement, she missed it. She'd also told him very solemnly the atmosphere there, real or perceived, was not a part of what had happened. Brad knew different. Ashley was truthful, but she didn't seem to realize fun was the source of the excitement. The breathless anticipation of the fun was what had been driving her mood up there in the hotel. No amount of talking could convince Ashley this was true. She accepted what he said, but there was a barrier in her mind he could not breach. She could not feel his concerns. She thought she was prepared to successfully suppress any future excitements and disconnects. She'd never let herself get into that condition ever again, she said. Brad, though, lived in fear of the next occasion Ashley might feel the need for that excitement she'd anticipated and experienced in that Dallas hotel. He lived with it every day. A philosopher once said all men lived lives of quiet desperation. Brad knew exactly what the man meant. "You ready for this?" Ashley asked with a smile. Brad nodded. He was. They'd never had time for a real honeymoon, and their one attempt to have a belated one last summer turned into a catastrophe. When Ashley won a week's stay at one of the Riverwalk's finer hotels in a charity raffle, they cautiously decided to try again. Grandma and Grandpa Rogers had the two girls for tonight, tomorrow, and Wednesday night. Then they'd take them to Ashley's mom and stepdad, who would take care of the Munchkins Thursday and Friday. Saturday and Sunday were reserved for Ashley's dad and her stepmom. With 3 sets of grandparents, the girls were in 7th heaven. They'd never had so much nonstop attention. Brad and Angela spent the first 3 days alone, except for the odd room-maid, a waitress or two in restaurants around, and the bellhop who brought up meals from the room service menu. They needed this time alone. They hadn't realized how badly they'd needed it until they were well into the break from everyone else. On Thursday, they needed to get out and decided to stroll down the Riverwalk to one of the sidewalk bars they'd been told served the biggest, coldest margaritas known to mankind. The afternoon sun was behind the tall buildings of downtown San Antonio. The walk down the river canal was a pleasant one. On the way they passed a group of girls in bright green, satiny warm-ups, a sports team of some kind taking the opportunity to visit one of the city's main attractions. The name of a prominent university was emblazoned on the front of the jackets and the girls' names on the back. Most of them were too pretty, in Brad's estimation, for athletes, but some were tall, almost hulking. As he and Ashley passed the group, One of the prettiest was tripped when she and another girl moved into the same empty space at the same time. She fell sprawling out in the busy sidewalk right in front of Brad. "Are you okay?" Brad asked sympathetically, kneeling quickly beside the young woman. Her first reaction to his question was to flush a bright fire engine red. A quick breath hissed in her teeth as she drew in some air. "I'm all right," she said in a small voice. Brad studied her carefully. He'd seen a lot of people fall precipitously and not realize they were badly injured until they tried to get up. "Well, wiggle everything to make sure," he suggested. "Let's make sure, okay?" The woman obligingly gave herself a perfunctory pat down, moving legs and twisting about in tiny arcs to check herself out. Brad didn't know it, but she was an accomplished gymnast and did, in fact, know the dangers of a sudden fall. "I'm okay," she told Brad. Her eyes were fixed on his face the whole time. Brad nodded, stood up, and extended his hand down to the young woman. When she clasped forearms with him, he hauled her up by main force. The girls all around noticed how little effort he had to use to pull the young woman upright. He might have just been doing an arm curl for all the strain he showed. The girl who'd fallen stood close to the older man for just a moment before stepping back. "All right?" Brad asked. She nodded, then responded to Brad's friendly grin. "Thank you," the young woman said in a low-pitched tone. "Por nada, señorita," Brad replied smoothly. "You take care now, here?" he said by way of a farewell. He was ready to step back and continue the walk down to where a pitcher of margaritas had his and Ashley's name on it. He was caught off guard when several of the girls who'd come forward to stand around the stricken young woman began giggling. "Back off, girls," Ashley remarked genially, her voice loud enough for all the girls to hear. "He's mine, ladies, all mine." A couple of the girls giggled again in a nervous reaction. The group did back away slightly, then closed ranks around the girl who had fallen. Their impromptu huddle excluded everyone else around, including Brad and Ashley. The couple resumed their slow walk down the side of the canal. "You didn't have to defend me," Brad said a short way down the sidewalk. "She was staring at they were looking at my nose, weren't they? I don't know why it's so funny. It's not that big," he complained. Ashley stared at him and pulled him to the shelter of one of the canopy-covered tables lining the walkway. She laughed softly. "Big guy. Did you ever get the wrong message?" she admonished Brad. "Baby, your schnoz isn't that big and I wish you'd get over it." She stood on tiptoes and pulled her husband's head down to kiss him on the bridge of the schnoz in question. From down the pathway, Brad heard a few final titters. His earlobes turned pink and his jaw muscles clenched tight. "Lover," Ashley whispered in his ear. "Those girls, they aren't laughing at you. They're laughing at themselves and at how exciting it was being so close to a big guy like you. Don't you know that?" Brad looked back down the sidewalk. He shook his head. "Nah, they," Ashley said emphatically, "saw those big strong hands of yours and they saw the muscles in your arms and how easy it was for you to get that girl up, not to mention how that pullover shows how wide your shoulders are and how your waist isn't." Ashley laid her hand on his chest. Brad felt his cheeks begin to heat. He started to protest his wife's words and her caresses. More than a few people were looking. "And the smartest of those girls saw those big clodhoppers you call shoes," Ashley continued before her husband could say anything. Ash chuckled when she saw Brad's eyes widen. "Honey, by the age of 14, every girl in the world has heard the saying that big feet on a man means he also has a big package too. Don't you know that?" she teased. "Did you really think they kept dropping their eyes because they were too intimidated by your manly presence?" she continued. "Huh. Sugar, those girls were some well-trained little crotch watchers," Ashley told him almost under her breath. Only her husband heard her. When Brad could only stand there red-faced and sweating, she chuckled again before taking his arm and pulling him into motion again. They strolled down the walk, happy to be with each other. "Wiggle everything?" Ashley whispered in Brad's ear as they sat at their table. "Wiggle everything?" Brad didn't understand at first, then remembered what he'd said to get the fallen young woman to check herself for injuries. His face grew red again. "Ashley," he said awkwardly, all I meant was she needed to." "I know what you meant," Ashley replied, cutting him off, "but did you have to tell a girl to wiggle everything?" She giggled quietly. "Don't you know what that did to that poor girl? It's not like her hormones weren't already boiling over or anything, right? You had to." "Enough," Brad ordered desperately. He knew his wife was teasing him, but come on. She obediently stopped for the moment. At intervals during the rest of the afternoon and evening, she would murmur, "Wiggle everything," just to watch her husband's jaw muscles tighten in frustration. After a nice tour of the Alamo, they took a taxi to one of the better steakhouses and enjoyed thick, incredibly tender steaks with baked potatoes swimming in butter. They stuffed themselves, loving every moment of frivolity they could have together before returning to the daily routine of children, jobs, and responsibility. Back in their room, they relaxed and watched a few minutes of late-night TV before deciding to hit the sack. Brad sat in the easy chair and read the newspaper that was provided with the room while he waited for Ashley to finish getting ready for bed. "Hey, honey," came the husky voice. Brad's ears pricked up immediately. He knew that tone. He turned his head to see his wife dressed or undressed in a red silk charmeuse nightshirt. Brad's nose flared as he watched her walk sinuously toward him. He'd never seen this piece of nightwear before. The slick fabric shimmered in the light and clung to every curve. It ended about mid-thigh. Brad's mouth was suddenly dry. His bare-legged wife came closer and his breathing grew short and fast. "Sugar," Ashley whispered softly, "if I wiggle everything, will you make love to me all night long?" "Oh, God, yes," Brad responded hoarsely. Ashley smiled and unbuttoned one of the two buttons. Late in the night, as they lay with their bodies entangled, Ashley cooed, "I've got what all those girls wanted today, my darling precious husband. I've got you." While she continued to tease her husband with the hot button phrase for weeks, it had lost its sting and its meaning had been transformed. In fact, he welcomed it whenever he heard it from that night forward. Saturday night, they wandered into the dimly lit hotel lounge after a satisfying steak and lobster dinner in the dining room. There were several other couples there, a cluster or two of young women, and several small groups of young men. The women appeared to be young office workers having some after-work drinks before they went home. The men were mostly in business attire with their ties slightly undone to show their rebellious natures. After ordering drinks from the overworked waitress, Brad and Ashley waited quietly, holding hands and listening to the piano player run through his repertoire of old piano classics. The pianist didn't have any spectacular skills, but the music was pleasant enough. Ashley patted Brad's hand to get his attention. "I gotta go to the little girl's room," Ashley said, patting his hand to get his attention. "Sit," she ordered him when he would have gotten up. One of the things that had intrigued Ashley when she first met him was his manners. She'd been amazed to find they were automatic and never contrived. "Yes, ma'am," Brad replied, grinning. He settled back and stretched his legs under their table while he watched his wife thread her way through the tables to the restrooms. Ashley was wearing a black halter dress Brad had picked out for her in a fancy store on the Riverwalk a couple of days before. The thing had a deep V neckline that showed off Ashley's figure very well. The smooth fabric fell smoothly over tummy and hips to a very low waistline where there was an inch-wide hem, several inches below the point of her hips. From there, a series of what looked like sheer, black scarves to Brad fell in layers to a point a few inches above her knees. Ashley said it was a handkerchief hem, which meant nothing to Brad. To explain his position in the matter, he adapted an old saw about not knowing what art was, but he knew what he liked and he liked this dress. The scarves swayed from side to side in time with Ashley's hips as she made her way around tables arranged haphazardly around the interior of the lounge. He enjoyed watching her. She was a well-built and earthy woman. He'd thought when he first met her she resembled the singer Enya to a high degree. A month ago, while watching an old John Wayne movie about a boxer in Ireland, he decided his wife was the spitting image of a young Maureen O'Hara with better legs. He smiled at the memory, then frowned. His eyes narrowed as he watched the effect his wife was having on one of the tables of young men. They'd broken off their conversations and were watching Ashley closely until she disappeared behind the concealing wall guarding the door to the ladies' restroom. One of the guys had held his drink suspended in midair the whole time. Now he put it down and drew in a great breath for a long sigh. A movement to his right made Brad look that way. Apparently, it wasn't just one table of men who'd been entranced with his wife. It seemed all three tables of males he could see were similarly affected. "Eat your heart out," he yelled silently to them, letting a wolfish grin come to his lips. "She's mine and you can't have her." A few minutes later, the grin turned to a snarl as he watched Ashley move almost sensuously through the small spaces between the bar tables on her way back to him. The men watched just as intently as they had before. This time, they also made a show of nudging each other with their elbows and leaned toward their friends to make low-voiced comments to each other. Brad's lips tightened when he saw the exhilarated flush on Ashley's cheeks. It seemed to Brad she made a slight detour to travel a couple of tables closer to one of the tables than she absolutely had to. Her hips were sashaying from side to side just a little more than they had when she left Brad's side. He could see that clearly. Brad got to his feet when Ashley was a few feet away. He stretched out an arm to pick up her chair and lift it in the air before moving it away from the table. While Ashley sat and slid her own chair closer to the table, Brad remained standing for a few seconds, trying to give the impression he was looking to see where the waitress was and what she was doing. She still hadn't brought them their drinks. Ashley looked up at him and smiled. "Staking out your territory, big guy?" she asked him in an amused tone. Brad glanced at her. He wasn't smiling. "Do I need to?" he asked bluntly. Ashley's face fell. She folded her hands on the tabletop and studied her painted fingernails for a moment. "I'm sorry," Brad said at last. "I really am, but those men were beginning to figure they might have a chance with you when you smiled at them. I didn't like what they were thinking. I didn't like them undressing you in their minds. It kind of got to me when you smiled right at them. Sorry." "Brad, honey," Ashley said after a bit. She reached out to put her right hand on his. She could feel the tension in him. "Honey, look, men have been watching me since I was 12 years old. I can't stop them. You know that. If I started carrying a gun and took potshots at them every time they looked my way, they'd still do it, wouldn't they?" Brad nodded reluctantly. She was right, but, Ash, it's not that, not completely. It's how you acted when you saw them watching. You smiled right at them and walked a little sexier, and for a little bit there, you gave them the show they were looking for. You know what I mean? The waitress finally brought them their drinks and Brad paid her, tipping her far more than the service was worth so she'd go away quicker. She went, showing him a tired smile. She had more customers this evening than she could handle. "Yeah." Ashley sighed after a while. "I know what you mean and you're right, Brad. I did like the attention and I know exactly how to put a little more into my walk than God intended. I like to do that, honey. I admit it." She tried to explain. "Honey, it's kind of like telling them, yeah, I'm one hell of a woman, and don't you forget it, and I'm saying eat your hearts out. Boys, you ain't never gonna get a piece of this 'cause I got my man." Her voice trailed off and faded into nothing. Brad jumped a little when his wife echoed the words he'd used in his silent declaration to the roomful of men earlier. Sometimes he believed Ashley could read his mind. The similarity in the words they'd used brought him up short. He let out a deep breath and took in another. "Yeah, I do know what you're saying, Ash, honey," he said in a lighter tone. Ashley looked up hopefully. "I'm really, really sorry," Brad apologized, bringing his wife's right hand up and kissing her fingertips. "Sometimes, I forget and a little jealousy sneaks up behind me and whoops me up alongside the hide, know what I mean?" He grinned at his wife. She smiled back. They listened to the piano as the pianist belted out a livelier tune. "You do it too," she told him, leaning close to whisper in his ear. Brad was astonished. "I do what? Look at women and enjoy them looking back," she explained. "I do not," Brad said hotly, trying not to raise his voice. "So your eyes didn't wander all over that group of college girls on the Riverwalk the other day, sweetie? You didn't tune out the ones who looked like they could play linebacker for the Cowboys and let yourself imagine what some of those cute ones looked like under those floppy warm-ups? You didn't smile just a little nicer to the pretty little waitress in that sandwich shop where we had lunch yesterday than you did to, oh, say the wrinkled old lady in the restaurant a little while ago." Ashley's voice had taken on an edge, but not for the reason Brad thought. He said and stopped to go back over the things Ashley had brought up. He sipped at his bourbon for a little more time. "I guess I might have a little," he admitted cautiously. His wife snorted. "Well," Brad began an explanation of what he meant, but he realized he was very close to whining. He hated that. "Well, I didn't make my hips go back and forth like that, and only because you can't make your hips go back and forth," Ashley retorted before Brad could finish. Brad shut up and considered. This was getting out of hand. He didn't want to argue with his wife and he'd already given up and agreed with her as much as he could anyway. "Brad, honey," Ashley said, "would you go to the bar and get us some napkins?" "Sure, hun," Brad answered. He welcomed the break. Maybe it would give them both enough time to squash this discussion back in its hole. He stood and adjusted his pants so they hung just a little better from his waist. Ashley had gotten them for him the same day. He pointed at the little black dress in the store and told her he wanted her to buy it. Passing one of the groups of young women, he glanced down and nodded when one of the women locked eyes with him. He saw she had on a sky blue blouse with at least one more button unfastened than a good boss would have allowed in the office. He couldn't see anything below the waist, but her upper body was trim enough. "Yes, sir," the bartender said, returning the smile Brad had on his face as he approached. "What can I get ya?" he asked. "Just a few napkins, if you can," Brad replied. "The ones we have are a little damp." "You bet," the man replied, pointing to a stack of cocktail napkins just to Brad's right. "Take all you need." Brad thanked the man and thumbed a half dozen or so off the stack. When he turned, he found he could see just enough under the table where the girls were sitting to confirm his impression the young woman who'd caught his eye did indeed have some nice legs. When he took a moment to arrange the napkins, the woman casually crossed one leg over the other. In the process, a lot of thigh that hadn't been in view before suddenly did become visible. His curiosity satisfied, he was ready to move on. He walked casually back to his and Ashley's table, taking care not to take any notice of the women, and in particular that woman. He had to dodge when a couple abruptly rose from a table he was passing, but he managed it without dropping the napkins or running into the attractive early 30s woman who stood so suddenly in front of him. He dropped the napkins on the table, handing one to Ashley. She didn't take it for a moment. Looking down to see what the problem was, he saw her wide grin. "What?" he asked apprehensively. "This couldn't be good, you dog," Ashley commented without heat. She pulled her husband down beside her and shifted in her chair to slide a trifle closer to him. This was nobody's business but theirs. She captured his left arm in her too and hugged it close. "Does she have good legs?" Ashley asked her husband. "Who?" Brad answered. His wife pinched his forearm. "Ouch," he complained. "Quit that, then don't fib," Ashley said calmly. "You know who I mean, that bottle blonde with the bedroom eyes and a miniskirt that got 4 inches shorter all of a sudden. Now does she have good legs?" "Maybe," Brad muttered. Ashley's fingers moved on his arm. Okay, yes," he said in a loud whisper. "Geez, very good, husband," Ashley purred. "Now which of the girls to her right or left is the most attractive?" Brad looked down at the long fingernails on his wife's right hand. "Left," he admitted glumly. Ashley giggled. "So you do check out other women even when I'm here, right? It's almost automatic, wouldn't you say, love?" "I guess, sorta," he murmured quietly. "But I never had any intention." "Wait, don't do that, and neither did you," he finished carefully. "Okay, I get it," he sighed. "Good boy," Ashley said by way of congratulation. "Now sweetie pie, honey bun, what is different about the outfit I got you Tuesday from the ones you normally buy?" Brad was at a loss. He usually wore short-sleeved pullovers when he wasn't at work, and that was what he was wearing now. His trousers were about the same. He often wore blue jeans at home, but when he wore anything a tad more formal, it was a pair of pants like this. "Well, pretty much no difference," he began slowly. Ash's fingers were twitching restlessly on his arm. "Well, the pants are a little, this isn't any criticism. Hun, it's not your fault, but they're a little tighter than I'd have bought, and very good, sugar," Ashley complimented him. "And how many tailored pullovers do you have? You did that on purpose?" Brad demanded. "I mean my pants, not the tailored. You meant to buy them that way?" Ashley giggled and patted his hand. "Brad, honey, listen, you have a cute little butt and really scrumptious thighs, big guy, and guess what? I like to see you in clothes that show that off." She grinned at her husband's expression. "And," she said before he could frame a comment one way or the other, "I got that shirt tailored because you have such a nice, manly shape from your shoulders down to your waist, and I love seeing your chest muscles under your shirt." Brad sat stunned. "Just," Ashley said, "like you love seeing me in a hot little black dress that shows off my figure and my legs and looks like the modern version of that 7 veils thing in the Bible, don't you?" Ashley smiled at the changing expressions that crossed her husband's face. Finally, he just nodded. "Now," she said in a conspiratorial voice, "do you want to hear how much those girls liked it when you moved so gracefully like a panther? Yes, you did, whether you realize it or not. You moved so smooth around those tables, and when you dodged that couple who got up so quick. Did they call you swivel hips back when you were in college, sugar? No? Boy, they should have. You could have been a star running back with those moves, honey." All the time she was shooting questions at Brad, Ashley was looking deep into her husband's eyes. Satisfied with what she saw, she sat back and picked up her drink. "Kind of different when it's on the other foot, huh?" she asked Brad. He winced. "I didn't know I was doing all that, and I didn't know you wanted me to dress differently," he muttered. "Well, You know now, Ashley whispered animatedly. Now you have the balls to admit it was kind of fun, wasn't it, sugar? You ready to tell me you could do that and still not have any thought in your brain of hooking up with her? She challenged. Brad took a deep breath. He glanced over at the table of girls and caught the blonde looking back. He didn't want her, would never know her name, in fact. But it was a nice confirmation of his manhood that she noticed him and might even want him. He prided himself on his honesty and integrity in everything he did. Letting some of the breath out, he nodded, then shook his head. I guess it was maybe some, but no. The idea of hooking up with Blondie never occurred to me, he said truthfully. Ashley smiled and leaned in for a long kiss. Staking out your territory, sexy lady? Brad asked. Damn straight, Ashley whispered. That girl better keep her hands to herself, by God. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next part.